Strong climbed back up through the hole in the floor, and the other juveniles gave it space as it shook itself off and glared at Juan with what might have been anger, or might have been grudging respect. Juan did not wait for them to decide how to react, because momentum was everything now, and he needed to keep them off balance and learning before they remembered they could simply tear him apart. He moved to the training equipment along the wall and began setting up his next demonstration, while talking in a steady voice that he hoped sounded more confident than he felt. Your species has ruled the galaxy through strength, and that strength has made you believe you are invincible. But humanity learned long ago that invincible things do not exist and everything has a weakness, and the trick is finding that weakness before your enemy finds yours. He pulled out cables and energy cells from the salvaged equipment and began connecting them in a pattern that would have made his engineering instructor proud. The juveniles watched with curiosity as he worked and even moved closer to see what the small human was building with such focus and intensity. Clever seemed especially interested and kept tilting its head and examining the connections Juan was making, like it was trying to understand the logic behind the design. Second lesson, Juan continued as he worked. Humans do not rely on what nature gave us because nature made us weak and slow and fragile. So instead we build tools and weapons and we modify our environment until we are the most dangerous thing in it. He finished the assembly and stepped back to reveal what he had built. It was a crude electromagnetic trap that would discharge a painful but non-lethal shock to anything that stepped on the pressure plate he had hidden under some debris. He gestured for one of the juveniles to approach, and naturally Strong stepped forward because it was still angry about falling through the floor and wanted to prove itself. The large Valkyrie moved confidently toward the debris pile, and Juan watched as its foot came down on the hidden plate, and suddenly electricity arced through the creature's body, and it convulsed and collapsed, smoking to the floor. The other juveniles leaped back and hissed, and their eyes went wide with alarm because they had just seen one of their own taken down by a trap they had not seen or expected. Strong was still breathing and already starting to recover, but the message was clear and brutal and effective. Juan walked calmly to the fallen juvenile and looked down at it. Humans invented ambush tactics 10,000 years before we left our home planet, and we have spent all that time perfecting the art of killing things that are stronger than us, and the way we do it is simple, but it works every single time, and the way is this. He paused and looked at each of the juveniles in turn. We wait and we watch and we learn your patterns and your habits and your weaknesses, and then we strike when you are not ready, and we strike where you are most vulnerable, and we never ever fight you on your terms. The hours passed and Juan moved from lesson to lesson with barely any time to rest or think about how tired he was or how much danger he was in. He taught them about retreat as strategy and showed them how human forces would fall back and regroup and attack again from a different angle until the enemy was worn down and exhausted. He demonstrated psychological warfare by using sounds and lights to disorient them and make them jumpy and uncertain. He explained the concept of sacrifice, where one human would give their life to save others or to complete a mission, and the juveniles struggled to understand this because Valkyrie culture valued individual survival above everything else. Quick proved to be the fastest learner when it came to movement and evasion, and Juan spent extra time showing it how human soldiers used cover and concealment to avoid detection. Left and right worked together naturally, so he taught them about coordinated tactics and how human squads operated as single units where each member had a specific role. Watcher absorbed everything quietly, and Juan suspected it was memorizing every detail for later use. Survivor already understood pain and loss, so Juan focused on teaching it about endurance and persistence and never giving up even when wounded. But Clever remained the most challenging because it kept trying to think 3 steps ahead and anticipate what Juan would teach next, and sometimes it guessed correctly, and sometimes it found solutions Juan had not even considered. This one would be truly dangerous when it grew up, and Juan found himself almost feeling proud of its progress, before remembering that he was training these creatures to kill his own species. The thought made him pause, and for a moment, doubt crept into his mind. What was he doing, and why was he helping the enemy? And would the humans he was trying to save curse his name when they died at the claws of these juveniles he was training so well? But then he looked at the countdown on his wrist and saw he had only 6 hours left until dawn, and he realized he did not have the luxury of moral contemplation. because survival came first and everything else came after. Third lesson, and this is the most important one, Juan said as exhaustion began to drag at his muscles and his voice. Humans are terrified all the time, and we are afraid of death and pain and losing the people we love, and we are afraid of the dark and the unknown and things with claws and teeth that want to eat us. The juveniles seemed confused by this admission, because they had been taught that fear was weakness, and weakness was death. Juan sat down on the floor because his legs were shaking and he needed them to understand this next part. But here is what you need to know about human fear, and it is the thing that makes us different from every other prey species in the galaxy. Juan looked up at the observation window where he knew Ren was watching. We feel the fear and we acknowledge it and we let it sharpen our minds and quicken our reflexes, and then we act anyway, and we call that bravery. And it is not the absence of fear, but rather the refusal to let fear control us. Strong had recovered from both its falls and its electrical shock, and it approached Juan carefully now with more caution than before. The large juvenile sat down across from him and looked at him with those alien eyes and made a sound that the translator interpreted as a question. Why do you help us when we will use this knowledge to kill your kind? Juan laughed, and it was a tired, broken sound, but it was genuine. Because your mother promised to eat me if I did not, and because I want to live, and because helping you is how I survive, and that is the most human thing I can do. He stood up slowly and checked the countdown again. 5 hours until dawn, and he was running out of demonstrations and running out of energy and running out of time. The juveniles had learned much, but he was not sure they had learned the most important lesson of all, which was that humanity's greatest weapon was not tactics or tools or even fearlessness, but rather the simple, stubborn refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds became. He needed to show them something that would burn itself into their memories forever, and make them understand on a visceral level what it meant to be human. He needed to put himself in real danger and survive through nothing but will and cleverness, and the kind of desperate creativity that only came when death was one wrong move away. Final lesson, he said, and his voice was steady despite everything. You are going to hunt me, and you are going to try to kill me, and I am going to survive until dawn, and in doing so, I will show you exactly why humans are the most dangerous prey you will ever face. The training chamber door opened, and Juan walked through it without looking back at the 7 juveniles, who watched him go with hunger and anticipation, and something that might have been excitement. Ren had unlocked access to the ship's maintenance corridors and service passages, and all the dark, cramped spaces where a human could theoretically hide from creatures twice their size. The hunt would begin in 5 minutes, and Juan used that time to move as far from the training chamber as possible while his mind raced through everything. He knew about Velkari hunting, behavior and ship layout, and the physics of confined spaces. The corridors were lit with the dim red glow that Velkari preferred, and everything smelled of ozone and metal, and the strange mineral scent of the aliens themselves. Juan found a junction where 3 passages met, and he pulled open a maintenance panel and squeezed into the narrow space behind it. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, and his hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But he forced himself to stay calm and focused, because panic would kill him faster than any predator. A klaxon sounded through the ship, and he knew the hunt had officially begun. He heard the juveniles spreading out through the corridors, and their claws clicked against the metal floors like the ticking of 7 deadly clocks. They were not trying to be stealthy because they did not need to be, and their confidence would be their first mistake. Juan waited in the darkness behind the panel and counted seconds in his head and tried to remember everything his survival instructors had taught him about evading superior forces. Strong came down the corridor first because of course it did, and Juan watched through the tiny gap in the panel as the large juvenile moved past his hiding spot without noticing him. The creature paused and sniffed the air, and Juan held his breath because he knew that Velkari had excellent senses, and the carbon dioxide from his breathing might give him away. After a long moment, Strong moved on, and Juan allowed himself to exhale slowly and silently. He slipped out of his hiding spot and moved in the opposite direction from where Strong had gone. The ship was massive and maze-like, and he used that to his advantage by doubling back and taking unexpected routes and leaving false trails that would confuse the hunters. He found a vertical access shaft and climbed up 3 levels using the maintenance ladder, and his arms burned with the effort, but he did not stop until he reached a section of the ship that looked like it handled environmental systems. Here, he found pipes carrying coolant and air and waste, and he began to formulate a plan. He used the plasma cutter to carefully cut into a coolant line, and the liquid that sprayed out was freezing cold and would lower the temperature in this section of the ship. Velkari were adapted to hot, dry environments, and cold affected their reflexes and metabolism, and he needed every advantage he could create. He moved quickly to the next junction and did the same thing, and soon he had created a zone of cold air that would funnel the juveniles into predictable paths, left and right. Found him next because they were working together and covering twice as much ground as the others. Juan saw them coming, and he ran deeper into the environmental section where the pipes were thicker and the spaces were tighter. The pair followed him, and their bulk made them slower in the confined area, and Juan used that by sliding under a low-hanging conduit that forced them to go around. He reached a cluster of junction boxes and quickly rewired the lighting controls so that the entire section went dark. The juveniles hissed in confusion, and Juan heard them stumbling and bumping into pipes and equipment because their eyes needed some light to function properly. He moved through the darkness using memory and touch and the faint glow from his wrist computer, and he felt like a ghost haunting his own grave. He found an emergency bulkhead control and activated it, and suddenly a heavy door slammed shut between him and his pursuers, and he had bought himself maybe 2 minutes before they found another route. Clever appeared from a side passage, and Juan realized it had predicted his movements and cut him off. This was the dangerous one because it thought like he did and anticipated his tactics and would not fall for simple tricks. They stared at each other for a moment, and then Clever lunged, and Juan barely dodged by throwing himself through a gap in the pipes that was too small for the Velkari to follow. He scrambled through the narrow space with claws scraping behind him and emerged into a zero-gravity chamber where the artificial gravity had failed or been turned off. He pushed off from the walls and flew across the open space while his stomach lurched from the sudden weightlessness. Clever entered the chamber behind him and immediately struggled because Velkari were not adapted for zero-gravity movement, and their powerful muscles worked against them when there was no ground to push against. Juan grabbed a handhold and changed direction, and watched as Clever spun helplessly trying to orient itself, and he felt a grim satisfaction at using the environment against his pursuer once again, but his satisfaction was short-lived because Quick entered the chamber from another direction, and it adapted faster than Clever had, and it was already learning to use the walls to propel itself. Juan pushed off hard and flew toward the exit on the far side, and he heard Quick gaining on him and felt claws brush against his boot. He grabbed the edge of the exit and pulled himself through and slammed the hatch shut behind him and spun the manual lock just as Quick crashed against the other side. 3 hours until dawn, and Juan was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and his muscles screamed for rest, and his lungs burned from breathing hard and fast. He had evaded 5 of the 7 juveniles so far, but he knew Watcher and Survivor were still out there, and they would have learned from the mistakes of the others. He moved through a section of the ship that looked like cargo storage and found containers stacked 3 high, and he climbed to the top and lay flat on his stomach to catch his breath. Below him he heard movement and saw Watcher entering the cargo bay. This juvenile moved differently from the others with careful, deliberate steps, and its eyes swept the area methodically, looking for any sign of disturbance. Juan stayed perfectly still and controlled his breathing, and became just another shadow among the containers. Watcher moved closer and stopped directly below him, and Juan could see the muscles in its shoulders tense as it prepared to look up. He did not wait for it to find him. He dropped from the container and landed on Watcher's back and wrapped his arms around its neck in a chokehold that would not kill, but would definitely hurt. The juvenile thrashed and tried to throw him off, but Juan held on with desperate strength, and finally Watcher went down to one knee. He released the hold and rolled away and ran before the creature could recover, and he heard it coughing and snarling behind him. Survivor found him in a dead-end corridor, and Juan realized he had made a tactical error by not checking his route carefully enough. The scarred juvenile advanced slowly, and there was nowhere for Juan to go, and this might be where his hunt ended. He looked at Survivor and saw the old wounds on its armor and knew this one understood pain and persistence and would not be frightened by desperate measures. "You have scars," Juan said quietly. "You have survived things that tried to kill you, and that makes you dangerous, but let me show you what humans do when we are cornered." He pulled the remaining explosive charges from his belt and armed them all and smiled at Survivor with blood on his teeth. "We become the most dangerous thing in the room. He threw the charges at the wall behind him and dove forward at Survivor, and the explosion tore through the corridor and ripped open the hull, and suddenly both of them were being sucked toward the vacuum of space. Juan grabbed a support beam and held on while debris and air rushed past him, and Survivor scrambled for purchase but could not find any and began sliding toward the breach. At the last second, Juan grabbed the juveniles' arm and activated his magnetic boots and anchored them both to the deck. They hung there in the howling wind, and Survivor looked at him with something like wonder, and Juan pulled them both back from the breach and hit the emergency seal, and suddenly the corridor was quiet again, except for their ragged breathing. He released Survivor and staggered away and checked his countdown with shaking hands. Dawn was 1 hour away, and he had survived, and he had shown them what it meant to be human. Juan collapsed against the corridor wall and watched the countdown on his wrist tick down to 0. And when it reached the final second, he closed his eyes and waited for whatever would come next. He heard footsteps approaching and opened his eyes to see all 7 juveniles standing before him, battered and exhausted, and looking at him with expressions he had never seen on Velkhari faces before. They were not looking at him like prey anymore, and they were not looking at him like a tool or a resource, and instead they looked at him the way soldiers looked at a commander who had led them through impossible battles and brought them out alive on the other side. Ren entered the corridor, and her presence filled the space like a cold wind, and the juveniles immediately moved aside to let her pass. She walked up to Juan and looked down at him with those frozen eyes, and her face was as unreadable as carved stone. He tried to stand, but his legs would not support him anymore, so he stayed on the floor and met her gaze without flinching, because he had nothing left to lose, and no energy left for fear. "Dawn has come," she said in that voice like cracking ice. "My children have been tested, and they did not catch you, and they did not kill you, and by your own rules that means they have failed." Juan felt his heart sink because he had misunderstood the test, and now he would die anyway after everything he had survived. But then Ren did something unexpected, and she smiled, and it was still cold, but there was something else in it now that might have been respect. But they learned, and they adapted, and they understood. And most importantly, they saw what it means to face a human who refuses to surrender, and that lesson is worth more than a successful hunt. She extended one massive clawed hand toward him, and Juan stared at it for a long moment, trying to understand what was happening. Finally, he reached up and took her hand, and she pulled him to his feet with effortless strength. Strong stepped forward and made a gesture with its claws that the translator said meant respect to worthy opponent, and the other juveniles followed. Sud and Juan felt a strange emotion rising in his chest that he could not quite name. "You have made them fearless," Ren continued. "They will not hesitate when they face humans in battle, and they will understand that strength alone is not enough, and they will fight with both their bodies and their minds, and that makes them the most dangerous hunters in the Velkhari fleet." Juan nodded slowly because his brain was still catching up with the fact that he was alive, and would remain that way for at least a little while longer. "So you will let me go now and return me to human space." Ren's smile widened and showed all of her crystalline teeth, and Juan felt a chill run down his spine because he recognized that expression now. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered exactly the prey it wanted. "No." The word hung in the air like a blade, and Juan felt his exhaustion drain away and be replaced by a cold anger that burned in his chest. "We had a bargain, and I kept my end, and your children are ready. The bargain was that if you failed, they would eat you," Ren said calmly. "You did not fail, and therefore you live, but I never said I would release you." She walked past him and gestured for him to follow, and Juan found himself moving after her, because what else could he do? They walked through the ship until they reached a large chamber that looked like a command center, and through the windows Juan could see dozens of other Velkhari ships floating in formation. Ren stopped at the window and looked out at her fleet. "You have value beyond this single lesson," she said. "My children are only the first, and I have many more broods that need training, and the war with humanity continues, and I need someone who understands both sides." Juan felt the weight of what she was proposing settle on his shoulders like chains. "You want me to train your entire species to kill mine? I want you to be a bridge," Ren corrected. "You will teach my people to understand humans, and in doing so, you will change how we fight this war, and maybe even why we fight it." She turned to Burr. Face him, and for the first time since he had met her, there was something other than coldness in her eyes. It might have been curiosity, or it might have been the beginning of respect, but whatever it was, it made her seem less like a monster and more like something he could almost understand. The Velkhari have conquered the galaxy through strength, but humanity has shown us that strength has limits, and for the first time in our history, we are facing an enemy that refuses to be conquered, and that terrifies the matriarchs who lead our people. Good, Juan said, and his voice was harder than he expected. They should be terrified because humanity will never stop fighting, and we will never surrender, and we will make you pay for every world you take. Ren nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had hoped for. That is why I need you, and that is why you are more valuable alive than dead. And that is why I am offering you a choice instead of simply keeping you prisoner. She walked to a console and activated a display that showed star charts and battle reports and casualty figures from both sides of the war. The numbers were staggering, and Juan felt sick looking at how many humans had died and how many more would die if the war continued. Work with me and teach my people and help me change the Velkhari from within, and in exchange, I will use my influence to end this war, not through victory but through understanding. Juan laughed, and it was a bitter sound. You think the matriarchs will listen to you? I think they will listen to results, Ren said. My children will be the most effective hunters in the fleet, and when other matriarchs see this, they will want their broods trained the same way, and slowly we will change our entire culture from one that values only strength to one that values intelligence and adaptation. She moved closer, and Juan could smell the mineral scent of her and see his own reflection in her frozen eyes. Humans are dangerous because you think and adapt and refuse to give up, but those same qualities make you valuable allies if we can move past trying to kill each other. Juan looked at the 7 juveniles who had followed them to the command center and were watching this conversation with interest. He thought about his dead crew and his destroyed ship and all the humans who would die if this war continued. He thought about what he could do as a prisoner versus what he might accomplish as something more. One condition, he said finally. You stop eating humans. Ren considered this for a long moment, and then she made a gesture that the translator said meant agreement with reservations. I will order my fleet to take human prisoners instead of killing them immediately, and we will begin negotiations for prisoner exchange. It was not everything Juan wanted, but it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you could hope for when the alternative was extinction. He extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, and Ren looked at it curiously before reaching out and wrapping her massive clawed hand around his much smaller one. They stood like that for a moment, and Juan wondered if anyone in human history had ever made a more unlikely alliance. What do I call you now? Juan asked. Am I prisoner or guest or something else? Ren's ice-chip smile returned. You are war teacher to the Velkhari matriarchy, and you will train our young and change our culture and help us understand the enemy we could not defeat through strength alone. She released his hand and turned back to the window. The war does not end today and peace does not come tomorrow, but we have taken the first step, and sometimes the first step is the hardest one. Juan stood beside her and looked out at the fleet of Velkhari warships and thought about his old life that was gone forever, and this new impossible life that stretched before him. He was still human, and he would always be human, and he would carry that with him into whatever came next. He had survived by being clever and desperate and refusing to surrender, and those were the most human qualities anyone could have. Strong approached and made a sound that the translator interpreted as question about next lesson, and Juan smiled despite everything, because the universe was strange and terrible and full of surprises. Next lesson, he said. We talk about something humans invented called diplomacy, and it is even more dangerous than everything I taught you so far. The juveniles gathered around him eager to learn, and Ren watched with her cold, calculating eyes, and somewhere far away the war between species continued. But in this small moment on this ship, there was the possibility of something different. Juan did not know if he was making the right choice, and he did not know if any of this would matter in the long run. But he knew he was alive, and he knew he could still fight in his own way, and he knew that sometimes the best weapon was not a gun or a blade, but rather an idea that could change minds. He was human, And he was war teacher, and he would teach these aliens what it meant to face humanity with respect instead of contempt. And maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference when the final battles came. The stars had never looked so beautiful to Captain Tae-yang as he guided the Harmony's promise through the final jump toward Coalition headquarters. His hands moved across the controls with practiced ease while his heart hammered with excitement. This was it, the moment humanity had dreamed of for centuries. First contact had happened 3 years ago when a Coalition scout ship found Earth's deep space probe. And now humanity was finally ready to join the galactic community. Tae-yang had spent 20 years exploring Earth's solar system, but nothing compared to this. Behind him, Ambassador Hae-won stood with her delegation, watching the viewport as an enormous station came into view. It was unlike anything humans had ever built, a massive structure that housed representatives from 47 different alien species. Hae-won felt her breath catch in her throat. She had prepared for this moment through countless simulations and briefings, but seeing the Coalition headquarters in person was overwhelming. The station glittered with lights from 1,000 different sources, and ships of every imaginable design docked at its many ports. She smoothed down her formal suit and checked her translator device one more time. Everything humanity had worked for depended on the next few hours. Her team had spent months learning Coalition protocols and customs. Earth's leaders had chosen her because of her skill in negotiation and her genuine belief that cooperation was better than conflict. She believed deeply that humanity could learn from these older civilizations and contribute something valuable in return. The docking procedure took another hour, and then Tae-yang was escorting Hae-won and her team through the station's corridors. They passed aliens of every shape and size. Some walked on 2 legs like humans. Others floated or crawled or moved in ways that defied easy description. A few stopped to stare at the humans with curiosity, but most simply continued with their business. The Coalition had seen many species come and go over the millennia. To them, humanity was just another newcomer, perhaps interesting but certainly not special. Tae-yang noticed how some of the aliens looked at them with what might have been amusement. It bothered him slightly, but he pushed the feeling aside. They were the new ones here. They had to prove themselves. The council chamber was even more impressive than Hae-won had imagined. Representatives sat in a circular arrangement, each in an area designed for their specific biology. Some breathed different atmospheres. Others required different gravity or temperature. The technology that made it all possible was far beyond Earth's current capabilities. Hae-won took her position at the speaker's platform and began her address. She spoke of humanity's hopes for peace and cooperation. She talked about Earth's long history of overcoming differences and learning to work together. She offered humanity's knowledge freely, asking only for the chance to learn and grow alongside the other species. Her words were carefully chosen and delivered with genuine warmth. The council listened politely, and after several hours of questions and discussions, they voted. Humanity was accepted as a probationary member of the Coalition. There were conditions, of course. Earth would have to follow Coalition laws, submit to inspections, and prove themselves worthy of full membership. But they were in. Hae-won felt tears of joy forming as she thanked the council. This was the beginning of a new era for humanity. Tae-yang smiled broadly as he watched from the observation area. His young officer Ji-woo stood beside him, but the younger man's expression was more guarded. Ji-woo had been in Earth's military before joining the Exploration Corps, and something about the way some council members had looked at Hae-won made him uneasy. Back on Earth, the news was celebrated worldwide. Humanity had joined the stars. Chief Scientist Dong-hyun watched the celebrations from his laboratory with satisfaction. He had been working on humanity's gifts to the Coalition, improvements to fusion technology that could help struggling worlds meet their energy needs. Dong-hyun believed deeply in sharing knowledge. Science belonged to everyone, he thought, and humanity's achievements should benefit all sentient beings. He had also prepared medical databases and agricultural techniques that Earth had developed. These would be presented to the Coalition as gestures of goodwill. His team had worked tirelessly to prepare everything, making sure the data was clear and usable by species with different biology and technology bases. Admiral Byung-ho watched the same celebrations from Earth Defense Fleet headquarters with more mixed feelings. He was an old military man who had seen too much of human history to be entirely trusting. While he publicly supported the Coalition membership, He had quietly begun what he called contingency protocols. These were defensive measures just in case. He ordered his people to study every scrap of information about coalition military capabilities. He diverted resources to secret research projects. He made sure Earth's defense satellites were upgraded and that new weapon systems were kept in development. When questioned by civilian authorities, he simply said he was being prudent. Peace was wonderful, but Earth needed to be able to defend itself if peace ever failed. The first year of coalition membership went smoothly. Human ships began trading with alien worlds. Donghyun's fusion technology was welcomed by several species and implemented on their planets. HFY established embassies and built relationships with dozens of coalition members. Cultural exchanges began, with humans learning alien arts and sciences while sharing Earth's music, literature, and philosophy. Taiyang commanded several missions that brought human explorers to worlds they had only dreamed of. Everything seemed perfect. Humanity was finally part of something greater than itself. But there were small signs that not everyone in the coalition viewed humanity favorably. The Velcros Empire, a powerful member species known for its military strength, seemed particularly interested in human biology. Their representatives asked many questions about human physical capabilities, their resistance to disease, their ability to adapt to different environments. HFY thought they were simply curious, but Jiwoo noticed that Velcros ships often appeared near human vessels. He reported his observations to Admiral Byung-ho, who quietly increased surveillance of Velcros activities. In the second year, a minor incident occurred. A human mining ship strayed too close to a Velcros military zone in a border region. Velcros patrol ships surrounded the mining vessel and detained the crew. The humans had made an honest mistake with navigation, but the Velcros held them for 3 weeks. HFY worked frantically through diplomatic channels, arguing that the punishment was excessive for an accidental violation. The Coalition Council eventually mediated, and the human miners were released with a warning. HFY considered it a victory for diplomacy. The system worked. Conflicts could be resolved peacefully through proper channels. Taiyang met with the released miners and heard their stories. They spoke of how the Velcros had studied them, taking biological samples and asking endless questions about human military capabilities. The miners had been treated roughly but not harmed. Taeyang reported everything to Byung-ho, who added it to his growing file of concerns. But overall, the incident seemed to prove that coalition membership was worthwhile. Problems could be solved through dialogue and mutual respect. Humanity's faith in the power of peace and cooperation grew stronger. They had made the right choice in seeking friendship with the stars rather than fearing them. 4 years had passed since humanity joined the coalition, and the cracks were beginning to show. The first disappearance happened on a Thursday, at least by Earth's calendar. A transport ship carrying supplies to the human colony on Arcturus 4 simply vanished. No distress call, no debris field, nothing. Captain Taeyang led the search mission himself, spending 2 weeks scanning every possible route the ship might have taken. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the ship and its crew of 43 people had been erased from existence. Taeyang reported the disappearance to coalition authorities and waited for their help. The response was disappointing. They filed it as a lost vessel, possibly due to mechanical failure or navigation error. No investigation was launched. Ambassador HFY tried not to let it bother her too much. Space was dangerous after all. Ships were lost sometimes. But then it happened again. Another human vessel vanished, this time a small passenger liner with 120 civilians. Then another. Then another. Over 6 months, 9 human ships disappeared without a trace. HFY brought the matter before the Coalition Council, with detailed reports and data. She spoke passionately about the need for a proper investigation. The council members listened with what seemed like polite indifference. Several representatives suggested that humans were simply inexperienced space travelers. Perhaps their ships were not as reliable as they thought. Perhaps human pilots were making errors. The council agreed to add the disappearances to their records but refused to launch an investigation. There was insufficient evidence of foul play, they said. Intelligence Officer Sang-min was not satisfied with that answer. He was a quiet man who had spent 15 years in Earth's intelligence services before joining the diplomatic corps. While HFY worked through official channels, Sang-min worked through unofficial ones. He cultivated sources among the various alien species, traded information, and slowly pieced together a disturbing picture. The disappearances were not random accidents. They followed a pattern. Every missing ship had been traveling through regions that bordered Velcro space. Sangman dug deeper and found something even more troubling. 3 alien merchants had witnessed human ships being attacked by vessels using Velcros weapons, but the attackers wore no identifying marks. The merchants were too afraid to come forward officially, but they told Sangmin their stories in secret. Sangmin brought his findings to Haiwan, who immediately demanded another council hearing. This time she had evidence, or at least testimony, but when the witnesses were called to speak, 2 of them refused to appear. The third recanted his story, claiming he had been mistaken. The Velcros representative stood before the council and denied any involvement in the disappearances. He spoke of how insulting it was to be accused without proof. He reminded everyone that the Velcros Empire had been a loyal coalition member for over 1,000 years. Several other council members spoke in support of Velcros. The matter was closed. Heywan left the chamber feeling sick. She had believed in the coalition, in the power of truth and justice. But now she was learning that power and politics mattered more than either. The attacks grew bolder. Human colonies on the frontier reported raids. Armed ships would appear suddenly, strike hard, and disappear before help could arrive. Small settlements lost power generators, food supplies, and sometimes people. The raiders were professional and efficient. They knew exactly what they were doing. Admiral Byung-ho mobilized Earth's defense fleet to protect the colonies, but space was vast and the raiders were clever. They struck where defenses were weakest and vanished before Byung-ho's ships could respond. The admiral knew in his gut who was behind the attacks, but knowing and proving were different things. Then came New Seoul. It was a beautiful agricultural world, green and peaceful, home to 40,000 human colonists. They grew food that fed 6 other human settlements. The colony had minimal defenses because it had never needed any. The attack happened at dawn. 5 warships appeared in orbit and began bombardment. The colony's emergency broadcast lasted less than 3 minutes before being cut off. Captain Tae-yang's ship was the closest, 2 hours away at maximum speed. He pushed his engines beyond safety limits, desperate to reach New Seoul in time. His crew could hear the terror in his voice as he urged the ship to go faster. They arrived to find ruins. The bombardment had been systematic and thorough. Every major structure was destroyed. The fields were burning. Bodies lay everywhere. Tae-young walked through the devastation with tears streaming down his face. His crew searched frantically for survivors. They found fewer than 200 people alive out of 40,000. The survivors spoke of ships with Velcros design characteristics, though they had no identification markers. One survivor, a young woman named Nari, had lost her entire family. Her parents, her brother, her grandparents, all dead. She stood among the ashes of what had been her home and stared at Tae-yang with empty eyes. She asked him why this had happened. He had no answer. Earth erupted in fury when news of New Seoul reached home. Millions took to the streets demanding action. Haewon appeared before the Coalition Council the next day, her usual diplomacy replaced by cold anger. She presented evidence collected from the attack site. She had weapons fragments, scanner records, and survivor testimony. She demanded that the coalition condemn the Velcros Empire and authorize a full investigation. The debate lasted for hours. The Velcros representative claimed that the weapons could have been stolen or sold on the black market. He suggested that pirates or rebels might be trying to frame his people. Other coalition members seemed reluctant to take sides. Finally, the vote came. The council offered its thoughts and sympathies to the victims but declined to take action. There was insufficient proof that the Velcros government was involved, they said. The evidence was circumstantial. Haewon stood in stunned silence. 40,000 people were dead, and the coalition was offering thoughts and sympathies. She looked around the chamber at the representatives from dozens of worlds and realized the truth. They were not going to help. They either did not care about human lives, or they were too afraid of the Velcros Empire to challenge them. Perhaps both. She returned to her embassy and sat in her office for hours staring at nothing. Everything she believed about the coalition had been a lie. The talk of cooperation and justice was just talk. When it mattered, when real evil needed to be confronted, they did nothing. Meanwhile, Commander Ji-woo was pursuing his own investigation. The young officer had never fully trusted the coalition, and recent events had proven his instincts correct. He took a small scout ship into the border regions where humans were not supposed to go. It was dangerous and probably illegal, but he did not care anymore. He spent weeks searching, using every trick he had learned in military intelligence. Finally, he found it. Hidden in a nebula beyond charted space was a massive Velcro shipyard. Hundreds of warships were under construction, far more than any species would need for defense. This was an invasion fleet. Jiwoo recorded everything he could and raced back to human space with his findings. The evidence was undeniable now. The Velcros Empire was preparing for war, and humanity was the obvious target. Byung-ho presented Jiwoo's findings to Earth's government, along with all the other evidence they had collected. The civilian leadership finally understood what the admiral had been saying all along. The coalition would not protect them. Earth was alone. Hae-won submitted her resignation as ambassador, unable to continue pretending that diplomacy would solve this. She told Earth's leaders that the coalition was either complicit in what was happening or too weak to stop it. Either way, humanity could not rely on them. Byung-ho called an emergency meeting of Earth's military command. The time for hoping and waiting was over. The Velcros were coming, and they would come soon. Everything that humanity had built over the past 4 years was about to be tested. The admiral looked at the faces around the table and saw fear, but also determination. They had tried peace. They had offered friendship and cooperation. They had played by the rules and trusted in the system. And they had been betrayed. Now they would have to fight, not because they wanted to, but because there was no other choice left.